Real quick, I want to revisit the Middle East problems that we talked about in the previous section. Of course, you have the radical Muslim jihadists, which we're going to talk a bit about more about how they came about here in just a few minutes. We talked about the history of Western exploitation of Middle East nations, especially for their oil, and the continuations of tensions with Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Terrorist targetings, of course, Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, the USS Cole 2000, pinpointing the work of Al Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden from Saudi Arabia. And of course, Clinton knew about this. He was well aware, along with the CIA, and keeping him informed. And he did call for airstrikes against Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. And then, of course, President Bush comes to office with that threat kind of hanging over everybody, and in the pipeline. But then we come to a new century, the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, and it begins with the 2000 presidential election. The 2000 presidential election, vice president to Bill Clinton, Al Gore from Tennessee, if you remember, ex-senator from Tennessee, will be the Democratic candidate, and the Republicans will run the governor of Texas. They choose the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, to be the Republican candidate. Bush doesn't have a lot of political experience except being governor. That was his first political office. He has a background in business and oil. I was the owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team. But then we had the election, and it was a very, very controversial outcome. The election, on election night, the pollsters and also the networks, television networks that were covering the election, were confused, first of all, and secondly, kept switching back and forth as to who the projected winner was. Was it Gore? Was it Bush? Was it Gore? Was it Bush? And eventually, it came down to the state of Florida and their electoral votes, and whoever won those electoral votes would determine who would be the next president. And even narrowing it down further, it came down to just a few counties in Florida who had to recount their votes, and then famously, the different types of ballots caused confusion in whether maybe somebody meant to vote for somebody or didn't vote. But anyway, it all ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court, as the Bush camp, or the Bush lawyers, were calling for, well, the Gore lawyers were calling for a continuation of the recounts by hand of the ballots, and the Bush camp was calling for an end to the recounts. And of course, ending the recounts would give Bush the very slim victory. And on partisan lines, the Supreme Court ended the recounts of the Florida recounts, and Bush became president a couple of months after the actual election outcome. Now, once he became president, Bush, who ran his campaign as somewhat of a moderate conservative, a moderate Republican, he quickly shifted to more conservative political stances after he became president. Many argue that it's the influence of the vice president, his chosen vice president, Dick Cheney, who was in the past Secretary of Defense, who's actually Secretary of Defense under the first Bush, President George H.W. Bush, during the first Gulf War, and then also under the influence of his close advisor, Karl Rove, and the House Representatives, one of the House of Representatives leaders, Tom DeLay. And some of the early policies of President Bush, the No Child Left Behind, NCLB, No Child Left Behind policies, which is basically the federal government taking over, if you will, the public education systems that had traditionally been very localized, and if any oversight was placed on public education or independent school districts, it was by the states, the individual states. But the national government was now implementing things like standardized testing and giving broad instructions and broad requirements to the states as far as qualifications for teachers and requirements for graduation. So what had traditionally been a state power was now co-opted, if you will, by the national government. And the main thing, I guess, the long-term impact of this is the implementation of these standardized tests that are required of all students in public schools. Tax cuts. That was always a big policy promotion of the conservatives and the Republican Party, and they always ran on tax cuts. And so the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Act, which was a law of tax cuts passed by the Republican Congress and signed by President Bush in 2001. Of course, if you cut taxes, you decrease revenue. And of course, with the healthcare costs growing, very, very quickly, taking up huge chunks of the gross domestic product, or GDP, that's more spending required. And so it created huge, huge deficits and exploded the national debt to over $8 trillion when you combine increased costs of things with less money, excuse me, less money coming in the tax cuts. There in the foreground, the forefront is President Bush, and in the background, Vice President Dick Cheney. And then probably the thing that, of course, President Bush's presidency is most known for was the 9/11 terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. Planes were flown into the World Trade Center. But there's a little background to this. The background is the instability of the Middle East and the rise of Islamic jihadists in the Middle East. And as I mentioned earlier in this class, it began with the ouster of the Shah of Iran, where the militants in Iran in 1979 took all those American hostages and held them in Tehran, the capital of Iran. And they implemented the leader of the revolution that ousted the Shah of Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini, implemented an Islamic government. So that kind of began the almost the domino effect. Then just a year later, 2 years later, Afghanistan, which was a part of the Soviet Union, saw a revolution begin, an Islamic revolution of what they called freedom fighters. They called themselves the Mujahideen, and of course the United States, seeing that Afghanistan is part of our enemy, the Soviet Union, and then this group is trying to form a revolution to overthrow the Soviet leadership. The United States instinctively wants to support this. That old saying, the enemy of the enemy is my friend. Well, the Mujahideen seemingly is the friend of the United States because they're fighting our enemy. So we began supporting them secretly with weapons and training and money. And one of the early freedom fighters, young leaders of this freedom fighting Mujahideen, was a young Saudi Arabian named Osama bin Laden. So that's why you really don't understand the long-term consequences of policies until sometimes many years later. And funding and supporting Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen will eventually turn into the Taliban, which will be who we fight in the war post 9/11. Also, though, the Iran-Iraq War, of course, that was in the 80s as well, where Iran went to war with Iraq. And once again, Iran being our enemy, we supported Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein. Of course, that based on that whole principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We supported Iraq, funded weapons for Iraq, and of course, we know later we will turn on them, and they will eventually be our enemy, part of the quote-unquote axis of evil. And then the fourth thing, attack on U.S. submarine barracks in Lebanon, killing 241 Americans in 1983. And then finally, just the spread of this all is part of the spread of jihadist ideology in the Middle East, which leads to 2001, the World Trade. There were really three attacks during 9/11. The World Trade Centers famously is the most high profile, where planes were flown into both towers of the World Trade Centers. A plane was also flown into the Pentagon, and another plane was hijacked and brought down in Pennsylvania. Um, Early on, the leader of this, Osama bin Laden, who we've had a long history with up to this point, from Saudi Arabia. Most people don't realize this, but 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. The others were from the United Arab Emirates, two of them, and then Egypt and Lebanon. And there's always been this question as to why Saudi Arabia was not the focus of our ire, was not the focus of our military attentions, considering that they were the ones that supplied the majority, a huge majority of the attackers that perpetrated 9/11. But instead, we eventually invade Afghanistan and Iraq, neither of which had a hand in. Well, Afghanistan for sure had a hand in it because they provided cover and support and help and training to Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, but Iraq had no hand in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And the first thing, of course, immediately after the attacks, we recognized that Afghanistan was one of the main perpetrators in helping or supporters in helping perpetrate the attacks. So we invade them rather quickly with wide support, by the way, worldwide support, generally, and local support at home. There's photos of the 9/11 terrorist attacks.